The morning sun cast long shadows across Fort Reynolds as Lieutenant Sarah Martinez stood in her quarters, staring at the crisp military uniform hanging on her closet door. In just 30 minutes, she would be expected to report for the most important formation of her career. But today, something felt different. Today, she couldn't bring herself to put on that uniform. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. What happened next would shake the very foundation of military protocol and leave a decorated base commander questioning everything he thought he knew about duty, honor, and the true meaning of service. Sarah Martinez had always been different from her peers at Fort Reynolds. While other officers focused on climbing the ranks and following orders without question, she possessed an analytical mind that constantly questioned the systems around her. Her personnel file was spotless, commendations for leadership, excellence in training programs, and a reputation for being one of the most reliable officers on base. But beneath her polished exterior, Sarah had been wrestling with something that kept her awake at night. For weeks, she had been documenting inconsistencies in the base's operational procedures, patterns that didn't align with the military's stated values of protecting and serving the American people. The previous month, Sarah had been assigned to oversee a routine training exercise that involved collaboration with civilian contractors. What she discovered during those 3 weeks would change everything. The contractors, working under a lucrative government contract, had been cutting corners on safety protocols for military personnel. Equipment that should have been tested and certified was being deployed without proper verification. Training materials contained outdated information that could put soldiers at risk in real combat situations. When Sarah brought these concerns to her immediate supervisor, Captain Robert Chun, she was told to focus on her assigned duties and leave policy matters to higher-ranking officials. But Sarah couldn't ignore what she had seen. She spent her off-duty hours researching military regulations, cross-referencing safety standards, and building a comprehensive report that detailed every violation she had witnessed. The deeper she dug, the more disturbing the picture became. The contract with the civilian company had been renewed multiple times without proper oversight. Key safety inspections had been waived to meet budget constraints. Most shocking of all, similar incidents at other military installations had been quietly swept under the rug to avoid embarrassing publicity. Sarah's investigation led her to a troubling realization. The uniform she wore every day represented an institution that was failing its most fundamental duty, protecting the men and women who served their country. The very system she had pledged to defend was putting soldiers in harm's way for the sake of bureaucratic convenience and cost savings. 3 days before the scheduled inspection by Base Commander Colonel William Harrison, Sarah made a decision that would define her career. She compiled her findings into a detailed presentation, complete with photographs, documented testimonies from fellow soldiers, and references to violated regulations. She knew that presenting this information would likely end her military career, but she also knew that staying silent would make her complicit in a system that endangered lives. The night before the inspection, Sarah sat in her quarters, reviewing her presentation one final time. She had spent years building her reputation as a model officer, earning the respect of her peers and superiors through dedication and exemplary service. Tomorrow she would risk everything she had worked for. As she prepared for bed, Sarah received an unexpected visitor. Sergeant Maria Rodriguez, a junior officer who had worked closely with Sarah during the training exercise, knocked softly on her door. Maria's face was etched with concern as she entered the room. "Lieutenant Martinez, I heard rumors about what you're planning to do tomorrow," Maria said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I wanted you to know that you're not alone in this. I've seen the same problems you've documented, and so have others. We're scared to speak up, but we believe you're doing the right thing." Maria's words provided Sarah with a moment of validation, but they also highlighted the weight of responsibility she carried. She wasn't just representing her own concerns. She was giving voice to countless soldiers who feared retaliation for speaking truth to power. The morning of the inspection arrived with unusual tension in the air. Colonel Harrison was known throughout the military for his strict adherence to protocol and his intolerance for anything that disrupted the chain of command. He had built his career on maintaining discipline and order, and his reputation for swift, decisive action preceded him wherever he went. As Sarah stood before her uniform that morning, she felt the full weight of her decision. Putting on that uniform would mean participating in a system she could no longer support in good conscience. But refusing to wear it would be seen as an act of insubordination that could result in court-martial proceedings. The formation was scheduled for 0800 hours in the main assembly hall. Officers and enlisted personnel from across the base would be present, along with Colonel Harrison and his staff. It was meant to be a routine inspection, a display of military precision and unity. Sarah made her choice. Instead of her standard military uniform, she put on her dress blues, the formal uniform typically reserved for ceremonies and special occasions. But even this felt like a compromise she wasn't willing to make. The uniform, regardless of its style, represented an institution that had lost its way. At 0755 hours, Sarah walked across the base toward the assembly hall. Other officers heading to the formation noticed her civilian clothes immediately: khaki pants, a simple white blouse, and a blue blazer that looked professional but was clearly not a military issue. Heads turned as she passed, and whispered conversations followed in her wake. When Sarah entered the assembly hall, the room fell silent. Nearly 200 military personnel were arranged in perfect formation, each wearing the prescribed uniform of the day. Sarah's civilian attire stood out like a beacon, drawing stares from every corner of the room. Colonel Harrison had not yet arrived, giving Sarah a few minutes to take her assigned position among the other officers. The whispers around her grew louder as her colleagues tried to make sense of what they were seeing. Some assumed she had made an honest mistake about the dress code. Others suspected something more deliberate was happening. Captain Chun approached Sarah with obvious concern etched on his face. "Lieutenant Martinez, what are you doing? You need to change into proper uniform immediately before the colonel arrives." Sarah looked at her supervisor with calm determination. "I'm exactly where I need to be, Captain. And I'm wearing exactly what I need to wear." Before Captain Chun could respond, the doors at the front of the hall opened, and Colonel Harrison entered. With his staff, the room snapped to attention as the base commander surveyed his troops. His eyes swept across the formation until they stopped on Sarah, the only person in the room not wearing a military uniform. Colonel Harrison's expression was unreadable as he walked to the podium. He had seen many things during his 30-year military career, but an officer deliberately appearing out of uniform at a formal inspection was unprecedented. The silence in the room was deafening as everyone waited to see how he would respond. At ease, Colonel Harrison commanded, his voice carrying across the hall. But his eyes never left Sarah, and it was clear that whatever he had planned for this inspection was about to change dramatically. Colonel Harrison's piercing gaze remained fixed on Sarah as he stepped away from the podium. The assembled troops stood at perfect attention, but the tension in the room was palpable. Every soldier present understood they were witnessing something extraordinary, a direct challenge to military authority that could reshape careers and potentially alter the course of their base's future. "Lieutenant Martinez," Colonel Harrison's voice cut through the silence like a blade. "Step forward." Sarah moved with measured confidence, her civilian clothes a stark contrast to the sea of uniforms surrounding her. As she approached the colonel, she could feel the weight of nearly 200 pairs of eyes following her every movement. This was the moment she had prepared for, Yet nothing could have truly readied her for the reality of standing before one of the military's most respected commanders while openly defying protocol. "Would you care to explain your appearance at this formation?" Colonel Harrison asked, his tone controlled but carrying an undercurrent of authority that had intimidated countless officers throughout his career. Sarah straightened her shoulders and looked directly into the colonel's eyes. "Sir, I cannot in good conscience wear a uniform that represents an institution currently failing in its primary duty to protect the soldiers under its command." A collective intake of breath rippled through the assembly hall. Officers and enlisted personnel exchanged glances, unsure whether they were witnessing an act of courage or career suicide. Captain Chun's face had gone pale, and several senior officers shifted uncomfortably in their positions. Colonel Harrison's expression remained impassive, but something flickered in his eyes, perhaps surprise, perhaps intrigue. "That's a serious accusation, Lieutenant. I assume you have evidence to support such a claim." "I do, sir." Sarah reached into her blazer and withdrew a thick folder containing her meticulously documented research. "For the past month, I've been investigating safety violations and procedural failures that directly endanger the lives of our personnel. What I've discovered represents a systematic breakdown of the standards we've sworn to uphold." The colonel accepted the folder, his weathered hands steady despite the magnitude of what was unfolding. "And you felt that refusing to wear your uniform was the appropriate way to bring these concerns to my attention?" "Sir, I've attempted to address these issues through proper channels. My immediate supervisor instructed me to focus on my assigned duties and leave policy matters to higher-ranking officials. But when those higher-ranking officials are part of a system that prioritizes cost savings over soldier safety, the chain of command becomes part of the problem." Colonel Harrison opened the folder and began scanning the first few pages. His eyes moved quickly across the documents, taking in photographs of defective equipment, copies of waived safety inspections, and testimonies from soldiers who had witnessed dangerous conditions during training exercises. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. "You compiled this entire investigation on your own initiative?" he asked, his voice carrying a note of something that might have been respect. "Yes, sir. But I wasn't alone in recognizing these problems. Many of our soldiers have seen the same issues I've documented. They're afraid to speak up because they fear retaliation. I decided that someone needed to take that risk." The colonel continued reading, his expression growing increasingly serious as he absorbed the scope of Sarah's findings. The room remained silent except for the rustling of papers and the occasional shuffle of feet from nervous soldiers maintaining their positions. After several minutes, Colonel Harrison looked up from the documents. "Lieutenant Martinez, these are grave allegations. If accurate, they represent failures at multiple levels of command. But your method of presentation is highly irregular and potentially grounds for disciplinary action." Sarah nodded, having anticipated this response. "Sir, I understand the consequences of my actions, but I also understand the consequences of remaining silent. Every day we delay addressing these problems, we put more soldiers at risk. I've calculated that risk assessment, and I believe the potential harm to our personnel outweighs the potential harm to my career." "Your career?" Colonel Harrison's eyebrows rose slightly. "Lieutenant, you're looking at possible court-martial proceedings. This isn't about a career setback. This is about your future in the military entirely." "I'm aware of that, sir. But I didn't join the military to advance my career. I joined to serve my country and protect my fellow soldiers. If doing that job properly means sacrificing my position, then that's a sacrifice I'm prepared to make." The colonel studied Sarah's face, searching for any sign of doubt or wavering resolve. He found none. In his 3 decades of military service, He had encountered countless officers who claimed to prioritize duty over personal advancement. Few had ever proven willing to risk everything to back up those claims. "Tell me about the contractor violations," Colonel Harrison said, flipping to a specific section of Sarah's report. "You've documented 17 separate instances of safety protocol failures. Walk me through the most serious." Sarah's mind shifted into briefing mode, her voice becoming crisp and professional. The most critical violation involved the deployment of communication equipment that hadn't undergone proper electromagnetic interference testing. During the training exercise, this equipment failed at crucial moments, leaving squads without contact with command. In a combat situation, this failure could result in friendly fire incidents or leave units vulnerable to enemy attack. And when you reported this to your supervisor? Captain Chun informed me that the equipment had been approved by the contracting office, and that questioning its functionality was outside my area of responsibility. When I pressed the issue, he suggested that I was being overly cautious and that real-world conditions would be different from training scenarios. Colonel Harrison's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. Captain Chun stepped forward. Captain Chun moved with obvious reluctance, his face flushed with embarrassment and growing concern. "Sir, is Lieutenant Martinez's account of your conversation accurate?" The captain's eyes darted between Sarah and the colonel, clearly struggling with how to respond. "Sir, I was following established protocols regarding contractor relations. My understanding was that equipment approval fell under the purview of the contracting office, not field operations. And when one of your officers raised legitimate safety concerns, your response was to dismiss those concerns rather than investigate them? Sir, I felt it was important to maintain focus on the training objectives rather than get bogged down in administrative details that were being handled by appropriate departments." Colonel Harrison's voice remained steady, but there was steel beneath the surface. "Captain, soldiers' lives aren't administrative details. When an officer under your command identifies a potential safety hazard, your responsibility is to ensure that hazard is properly addressed, not to redirect that officer's attention elsewhere." The rebuke hung in the air like a physical presence. Captain Chun's face reddened further, and several officers in the formation shifted uncomfortably. Sarah felt no satisfaction in watching her supervisor's public humiliation. She had hoped her investigation would reveal systemic problems that could be addressed without destroying individual careers. "Lieutenant Martinez," Colonel Harrison continued, "your report mentions similar problems at other installations. How did you obtain this information?" "Sir, I used my security clearance to access incident reports from other bases. I also reached out to colleagues at different installations who had mentioned similar concerns during professional development conferences. The pattern suggests this isn't an isolated problem specific to Fort Reynolds." The colonel nodded slowly, his expression thoughtful. "And your conclusion?" "Sir, my conclusion is that cost-cutting measures implemented across multiple military installations have created a culture where safety concerns are treated as obstacles to efficiency rather than essential elements of operational readiness. We're training soldiers to use equipment that may fail them in combat, and we're doing it to save money on contracts." Colonel Harrison closed the folder and stood silently for several long moments. The assembled troops remained at attention, but the psychological tension in the room was almost unbearable. Everyone present understood they were witnessing a moment that could define the future of military accountability. "Lieutenant Martinez," the colonel finally said, his voice carrying across the silent hall, "your methods are unorthodox, your presentation is insubordinate, and your accusations are serious. Enough to end careers throughout the chain of command." Sarah braced herself for the consequences she had always known would come. "However," Colonel Harrison continued, "your documentation is thorough, your concerns are legitimate, and your courage in bringing these issues to light may have prevented Casualties that would have haunted this base for years to come. The colonel's words hung in the air like a suspended verdict. Sarah felt her heart racing as she tried to interpret the meaning behind his carefully chosen phrases. Around her, the assembled soldiers maintained their rigid postures, but she could sense the collective held breath of nearly 200 people waiting to see how this unprecedented confrontation would resolve. Colonel Harrison stepped closer. To Sarah, his voice dropping to a tone that only she and the nearest officers could hear clearly. "Lieutenant, in my 30 years of service, I've seen officers who blindly followed orders without question, and I've seen officers who questioned everything to the point of paralysis. But I've rarely encountered an officer willing to sacrifice their career to protect soldiers they've never met at installations they've never visited." Sarah remained at attention, unsure whether the colonel's words represented praise or the prelude to her dismissal. "Sir, I believe that's what we're supposed to do. The oath we took wasn't to protect only the soldiers under our direct command. It was to support and defend the Constitution and the principles it represents. And you believe those principles are being violated by the contracting procedures you've documented?" "Sir, I believe we've allowed bureaucratic efficiency to override our fundamental responsibility to the men and women who put their lives on the line for this country. When we deploy equipment that we know is substandard, when we waive safety inspections to meet budget deadlines, when we silence officers who raise legitimate concerns, we're not just failing individual soldiers. We're failing the American people who trust us to maintain military readiness." Colonel Harrison nodded slowly, his expression revealing nothing of his internal deliberations. He turned to address the formation, his voice carrying to every corner of the assembly hall. "What you're witnessing here today is the difference between compliance and leadership. Compliance would have meant Lieutenant Martinez putting on her uniform, standing in formation, and keeping her concerns to herself. Leadership means recognizing when the system needs to change and being willing to take personal risks to initiate that change." The words sent a ripple of surprise through the assembled troops. Several officers exchanged glances, uncertain whether the colonel was endorsing Sarah's actions or setting up a larger point about the consequences of insubordination. "That said," Colonel Harrison continued, "the military cannot function without discipline and respect for the chain of command. Lieutenant Martinez, your decision to appear out of uniform at this formation was a direct violation of military protocol. Your choice to present your concerns publicly rather than through established channels represents a challenge to military authority that cannot be overlooked." Sarah felt her stomach drop. She had known this moment would come, but hearing the colonel articulate her violations in front of the entire base made the reality of her situation undeniably clear. "However," the colonel said, his tone shifting subtly, "there are times when moral courage requires actions that transcend normal protocols. There are moments when an officer must choose between following orders and fulfilling their deeper obligation to the institution they serve. Based on the evidence you've presented, Lieutenant Martinez, this appears to be one of those moments." "Colonel." Harrison opened Sarah's folder again, holding up several photographs of damaged equipment. "These images show communication devices that failed during training exercises. This documentation reveals that similar equipment failures have occurred at 7 other military installations over the past 6 months. The pattern suggests a systemic problem that has been ignored by multiple levels of command." He turned to Captain Chun, who was still standing at uncomfortable attention nearby. "Captain, when Lieutenant Martinez brought these concerns to your attention, what specific steps did you take to investigate them?" Captain Chun's voice was barely audible. "Sir, I advised her to focus on her assigned duties and trust that equipment. Approval processes were being handled appropriately by the contracting office." "Did you contact the contracting office to verify that these processes were being followed correctly?" "No, sir." "Did you forward Lieutenant Martinez's concerns to anyone in the chain of command?" "No, sir." Did you document her safety concerns? In any official capacity? No, sir. Colonel Harrison's expression hardened. So when an officer under your command identified equipment that could endanger soldiers' lives, your response was to dismiss those concerns without any investigation whatsoever? Sir, I believed I was following proper procedures by maintaining focus on the training mission and trusting established systems. Captain Chun, proper procedures exist to ensure soldier safety, not to avoid difficult conversations with contractors. Your failure to investigate these concerns represents a dereliction of duty that could have resulted in casualties. The public rebuke was devastating. Captain Chun's face had gone completely pale, and several officers in the formation looked visibly uncomfortable witnessing their colleagues' professional humiliation. Colonel Harrison turned back to Sarah, his expression softening slightly. Lieutenant Martinez, your methods were unorthodox, but your motives were sound. Your documentation is thorough, your analysis is accurate, and your courage in bringing these issues to light demonstrates the kind of leadership this military needs. Sarah felt a surge of hope, but she remained cautious. The colonel's words could still be leading toward disciplinary action, despite his apparent approval of her investigation. That said, Colonel Harrison continued, I cannot ignore the fact that you deliberately violated military protocol. Your refusal to wear the uniform represents a breach of discipline that requires consequences. However, given the circumstances and the critical nature of your findings, I'm prepared to offer you a choice. The colonel paused, letting his words register with both Sarah and the assembled troops. You can accept a formal reprimand for your uniform violation, which will remain in your personnel file, but will not result in court-martial proceedings. In exchange, you will work directly with my staff to investigate every concern you've documented and implement corrective measures across this base. Sarah's heart leaped. The offer was far more generous than she had dared hope for. Sir, I accept those terms. Or, Colonel Harrison continued, you can request a transfer to the Pentagon, where you'll work with a joint task force investigating similar problems at military installations nationwide. This assignment would involve travel to multiple bases, extensive documentation requirements, and the authority to recommend policy changes at the highest levels of military command. The second option was unexpected and extraordinary. Sarah realized she was being offered the opportunity to expand her investigation beyond Fort Reynolds, to address the systemic problems she had identified across the entire military structure. Sir, may I ask what would happen to the soldiers here if I chose the Pentagon assignment? Colonel Harrison smiled for the first time during the entire exchange. Lieutenant, that question demonstrates exactly why you're the right person for either position. If you choose the Pentagon assignment, I'll personally ensure that every problem you've identified at Fort Reynolds is addressed immediately. We'll terminate our contract with the problematic contractors, implement new safety protocols, and establish procedures to prevent these issues from recurring. Sarah considered her options carefully. Staying at Fort Reynolds would allow her to see her investigation through to completion and ensure that the soldiers she had worked with would benefit from the changes she had documented. But the Pentagon assignment would give her the opportunity to address similar problems across the entire military system. Sir, I believe the Pentagon assignment would allow me to have the greatest impact on soldier safety across all military installations. Colonel Harrison nodded approvingly. I was hoping you'd make that choice. Lieutenant Martinez, your transfer orders will be processed immediately. You'll report to the Pentagon next Monday to begin your new assignment. He turned to address the formation one final time. What happened here today should serve as a lesson to every officer and enlisted person on this base. Leadership isn't about following orders blindly. It's about having the courage to do what's right, even when it's difficult. Lieutenant Martinez demonstrated that courage, and our military is stronger because of officers like her. The colonel's words reverberated through the assembly hall as he dismissed the formation. As soldiers began filing out, many approached Sarah to shake her hand or offer quiet words of support. Several officers who had witnessed the exchange told her they had observed similar problems, but had lacked the courage to speak up. Sergeant Rodriguez appeared at Sarah's side, her face beaming with pride. "Lieutenant, what you did today was incredible. You gave voice to concerns that so many of us have been carrying." As the hall emptied, Colonel Harrison approached Sarah one final time. "Lieutenant, I want you to know that your actions today will have consequences far beyond this base. The Pentagon assignment isn't just about investigating problems. It's about preventing them from happening in the future." Sarah stood straighter, feeling the weight of responsibility settling on her shoulders. "Sir, I won't let you down." "I know you won't, and Lieutenant, tomorrow morning you'll want to wear your uniform. You've earned the right to wear it with pride." 3 days later, Sarah found herself in the labyrinthine corridors of the Pentagon, her freshly pressed uniform bearing the insignia of her new assignment. The building's imposing architecture seemed to whisper the weight of decisions that had shaped American military history, and she couldn't help but feel the magnitude of her new responsibility. Her destination was Room 3, E880, where the Joint Task Force on Military Safety Standards had been hastily assembled in response to her findings. As she approached the conference room, Sarah noticed through the glass windows that several high-ranking officers were already seated around a polished mahogany table, their faces grave with concentration. Brigadier General Patricia Williams, a decorated veteran with silver hair and piercing blue eyes, looked up as Sarah entered. "Lieutenant Martinez, welcome to Washington. I've read your report from Fort Reynolds, and I must say, your investigation has caused quite a stir in the upper echelons of military command." Sarah took her assigned seat, noting that she was the most junior officer in the room by several ranks. Around the table sat colonels, lieutenant colonels, and civilian defense contractors whose expertise would be crucial in addressing the systemic problems she had uncovered. "General Williams, I appreciate the opportunity to contribute to this task force. I want to ensure that the safety concerns I documented at Fort Reynolds are addressed comprehensively across all military installations." General Williams nodded, opening a thick briefing folder. "Your timing was impeccable, Lieutenant. 3 days ago, we received reports of equipment failures at Fort Campbell that mirror exactly the problems you identified. Communication devices failed during a live-fire exercise, resulting in a friendly fire incident that left 2 soldiers wounded." The words hit Sarah like a physical blow. She had hoped her investigation would prevent such incidents, but the news from Fort Campbell confirmed her worst fears. The problems were widespread and causing real harm to American soldiers. "How serious were the injuries?" Sarah asked, her voice tight with concern. "Both soldiers will recover, but one required surgery for shrapnel wounds that could have been prevented with properly functioning communication equipment. The incident has prompted an immediate review of all military contracts involving communication systems." Colonel James Patterson, a logistics expert with extensive experience in military contracting, leaned forward. "Lieutenant Martinez, your documentation has helped us identify that the problematic contractor, Meridian Defense Solutions, has active contracts with 43 military installations across the United States. The potential scope of this problem is staggering." Sarah felt the weight of responsibility settling heavier on her shoulders. "Sir, what steps are being taken to address these contracts immediately?" General Williams consulted her notes. "As of this morning, all Meridian Defense Solutions contracts have been suspended, pending a comprehensive audit. We've also initiated immediate inspections of communication equipment at every installation where their devices are deployed. However," Colonel Patterson added, "suspending these contracts creates operational challenges. Meridian was providing Equipment for training exercises that are crucial for maintaining military readiness. We need to balance safety concerns with operational requirements. The comment sparked something in Sarah that she hadn't expected. Sir, with respect, there is no balance between safety and operational requirements. If our equipment isn't safe, then our operational readiness is compromised. Training soldiers with faulty equipment doesn't prepare them for combat. It sets them up for failure. The room fell silent for a moment. Several officers exchanged glances, clearly unused to such direct challenges from a lieutenant. But General Williams smiled slightly, apparently appreciating Sarah's unwavering commitment to her principles. Lieutenant, you're absolutely right. But implementing that philosophy requires significant changes to how we approach military contracting. It also requires budget allocations that may not be popular with congressional oversight committees. Sarah had anticipated this obstacle. General, I've been researching the financial implications of equipment failures. The cost of replacing faulty equipment, retraining soldiers, and addressing casualties from preventable incidents far exceeds the savings from choosing cheaper contractors. She opened her own folder, revealing financial analyses she had compiled during her 3 days of preparation. Based on data from the past 5 years, equipment failures have resulted in approximately $200 million in additional costs to the military. This includes medical expenses for injured soldiers, replacement of damaged equipment, and extended training periods to compensate for unreliable systems. Colonel Patterson examined Sarah's financial projections with obvious interest. These numbers are compelling, Lieutenant. If accurate, they suggest that prioritizing safety would actually save money in the long term. That's exactly my conclusion, sir. We've been thinking about this problem backwards. Instead of asking how we can save money on contracts, we should be asking how we can prevent the costs associated with equipment failures. General Williams made notes as Sarah spoke. Your analysis addresses one of our biggest challenges in presenting these findings to military leadership. If we can demonstrate that safety improvements are also cost-effective, we're more likely to secure support for comprehensive changes. The discussion continued for the next 2 hours, with Sarah presenting detailed evidence from her investigation and the task force members contributing their expertise in various aspects of military operations. As the meeting progressed, Sarah realized that her role was evolving from simply documenting problems to helping develop solutions. Lieutenant Martinez, General Williams said as the meeting concluded, your first assignment for this task force will be to visit Fort Campbell and conduct a comprehensive investigation of the friendly fire incident. You'll have access to all personnel involved, complete authority to review equipment and procedures, and the support of my staff. Sarah nodded, feeling both excitement and trepidation. General, when do I leave for Fort Campbell? Tomorrow morning. But before you go, I want you to understand something important. Your actions at Fort Reynolds have already begun to change how military leadership thinks about safety protocols. Colonel Harrison has been in contact with base commanders across the country, sharing your findings and encouraging them to review their own contracting procedures. The news was encouraging, but Sarah remained focused on the practical challenges ahead. General, what authority will I have at Fort Campbell to implement changes? You'll be operating under my direct authority, which gives you significant leverage. But remember, Lieutenant, real change happens when people are convinced that change is necessary. Your job isn't just to identify problems, it's to help base commanders understand why addressing these problems is crucial for military effectiveness. As Sarah left the Pentagon that evening, she reflected on how dramatically her life had changed in just 1 week. 7 days ago, she had been a relatively unknown lieutenant at Fort Reynolds, wrestling with whether to risk her career by speaking up about safety concerns. Now she was part of a task force that could potentially reshape military contracting procedures across the entire United States Armed Forces. Her phone buzzed with a text message from Sergeant Rodriguez, Lieutenant, wanted you to know that Colonel Harrison has already terminated 3 contractor relationships and implemented new safety protocols. The soldiers here are calling you a hero. Sarah smiled at the message, but she knew her work was far from over. The friendly fire incident at Fort Campbell proved that similar problems existed at other installations, and preventing future casualties would require sustained effort across multiple military bases. The next morning, as Sarah boarded a military transport plane bound for Fort Campbell, she carried with her not just the authority of the Pentagon Task Force, but the knowledge that her willingness to refuse wearing a uniform had started something much larger than she had ever imagined. During the flight, she reviewed the preliminary reports from Fort Campbell. The injured soldiers were Private First Class Michael Thompson and Specialist Jennifer Davis, both members of an infantry unit that had been conducting routine training exercises. The communication equipment failure had occurred during a simulated combat scenario, causing confusion about unit positions that led to the friendly fire incident. As the plane descended toward Fort Campbell, Sarah looked out the window at the sprawling military installation below. Somewhere on that base, 2 soldiers were recovering from injuries that could have been prevented. Their sacrifice had not been in service of their country's enemies, but in service of a system that had failed them. Sarah adjusted her uniform and prepared to disembark, knowing that her investigation at Fort Campbell would determine whether her actions at Fort Reynolds had been the beginning of real change or merely a temporary disruption in a system resistant to reform. The true test of her courage was just beginning. Fort Campbell's medical facility was Sarah's first stop upon arriving at the Kentucky installation. The sterile hallways and antiseptic smell reminded her of the human cost behind the statistics and reports she had been analyzing. Private First Class Michael Thompson was awake when she entered his room, his left shoulder heavily bandaged but his eyes alert and focused. "Private Thompson, I'm Lieutenant Martinez from the Pentagon Task Force on Military Safety Standards. How are you feeling?" The young soldier, barely 22 years old, shifted carefully in his hospital bed. "Better than I was 3 days ago, ma'am. The doctors say I'll make a full recovery, but it's going to take some time for the shrapnel wounds to heal completely." Sarah pulled up a chair beside his bed, her notebook ready, but her demeanor deliberately informal. "I'm here to investigate what happened during your training exercise. I want you to know that anything you tell me will be used to prevent similar incidents from happening to other soldiers." Thompson's expression grew serious. "Ma'am, I've been thinking about that exercise non-stop since I got here. Something was definitely wrong with our communication equipment. We kept losing contact with command at critical moments. Tell me exactly what happened from your perspective." Thompson took a deep breath, wincing slightly as the movement pulled at his bandages. "We were conducting a simulated urban warfare exercise. My squad was advancing on a target building while Specialist Davis's squad was providing overwatch from an elevated position. About halfway through the exercise, our radio started cutting out." Sarah made notes as he spoke, but her attention was focused entirely on his account of the events. "What did you do when the radios failed?" "Standard protocol, ma'am. We tried to re-establish communication using hand signals and predetermined rally points. But the exercise scenario was designed around radio coordination. Without reliable communication, we were basically operating blind. And that's when the friendly fire incident occurred." Thompson nodded grimly. "My squad reached what we thought was our objective, but we had missed a communication update about a change in the exercise parameters. Specialist Davis's squad had been repositioned, and without working radios, we didn't know their new location. When we breached the building, they thought we were simulated enemy forces." The clinical details of the incident painted a clear picture of how equipment failure had created a dangerous situation. Sarah realized that under actual combat conditions, similar communication breakdowns could result in far more serious casualties. "Private, Thompson, had you experienced radio problems during previous training exercises? Yes, ma'am. Over the past month, we've had intermittent communication issues during at least 4 different exercises. Our squad leaders reported the problems, but we were told the equipment was functioning within acceptable parameters. Sarah felt a familiar surge of anger at the phrase acceptable parameters. It was the same bureaucratic language that had been used to dismiss safety concerns at Fort Reynolds. Did anyone from the contracting office or equipment manufacturer ever come to inspect the radios? Not that I saw, ma'am. We were just told to adapt our tactics to work around the communication issues. After finishing her interview with Thompson, Sarah visited Specialist Jennifer Davis in the next room. Davis, a 24-year-old communications specialist, provided additional details that painted an even more troubling picture of the equipment. Failures. Lieutenant, those radios have been problematic since the day they were installed, Davis explained, her right arm in a sling from shrapnel that had struck her during the confusion. As the communications specialist for my unit, I've documented at least a dozen instances where the equipment failed during critical moments of training exercises. And what happened to those documentation reports? They were filed with our company commander, who said they would be forwarded to the appropriate technical support channels. But we never received any follow-up, and the problems kept happening. Sarah made extensive notes about the communication breakdown, but she was beginning to see a pattern that extended beyond technical failures. There seemed to be a systematic disregard for soldier feedback about equipment problems, with multiple levels of command failing to take corrective action. Her next stop was the office of Lieutenant Colonel Rebecca Hayes, the base commander responsible for training operations. Colonel Hayes was a stern woman in her mid-40s with a reputation for running efficient training programs and maintaining high operational standards. Lieutenant Martinez, I understand you're here about the friendly fire incident. I want to assure you that we've conducted our own internal investigation and implemented immediate changes to our training protocols. Sarah appreciated the colonel's directness, but she had learned to look beyond immediate responses to identify systemic issues. Colonel Hayes, I'm more interested in understanding how equipment problems were handled before the incident occurred. Did you receive reports about radio communication failures? Colonel Hayes consulted a thick file on her desk. We received multiple reports about intermittent communication issues over the past several months. Our technical support staff worked with the contractor to address these problems, but we were assured that the equipment was operating within normal performance parameters. Did you consider suspending training exercises until the communication problems were resolved? The colonel hesitated before answering. Lieutenant, we have mandated training schedules that must be maintained to ensure our soldiers are combat ready. Suspending exercises because of minor equipment glitches would significantly impact our operational preparedness. Sarah recognized the same institutional thinking that had allowed problems to persist at Fort Reynolds. Colonel, with respect, equipment failures that prevent effective communication between units aren't minor glitches. They're safety hazards that compromise the very operational preparedness you're trying to maintain. Perhaps, but we also have to balance equipment concerns with training requirements. Our soldiers need to be prepared for situations where communication equipment might fail in actual combat. Colonel Hayes, there's a difference between training soldiers to handle equipment failures and training them with equipment that's guaranteed to fail. One prepares them for contingencies, the other puts them at unnecessary risk. The conversation continued for another hour, with Sarah documenting the decision-making processes that had led to the friendly fire incident. She was beginning to understand that the problems she had identified weren't just about faulty equipment. They were about institutional cultures that prioritized adherence to schedules over soldier safety. That evening, Sarah met with the technical support staff responsible for maintaining the communication equipment. Sergeant First Class David Kim, the senior communications technician, provided the most revealing insights of her investigation. "Lieutenant, I've been working on military communication systems for 12 years, and I've never seen equipment this unreliable deployed at a major installation," Sergeant Kim explained as he showed Sarah through the communications maintenance facility. "What makes this equipment different from previous systems?" "The manufacturing tolerances are looser, the components are cheaper, and the testing protocols are less rigorous. When I compared these radios to the previous generation, the difference in quality was obvious." Sarah examined one of the problematic radio units, noting the lightweight construction that seemed flimsy compared to military equipment she had handled before. "Did you report these quality concerns to your superiors?" "Multiple times. I submitted detailed technical reports documenting failure rates, component deficiencies, and reliability issues. But the contract had already been signed, and I was told that replacing the equipment wasn't financially feasible." "What would happen if these radios failed during actual combat operations?" Sergeant Kim's expression grew grave. "Lieutenant, communication is the backbone of modern military operations. If these radios failed during combat, units would lose coordination, tactical advantages would be compromised, and soldiers would die. It's that simple." As Sarah concluded her interviews at Fort Campbell, she realized that her investigation had uncovered something more serious than equipment failures. She had identified a systematic prioritization of cost savings over soldier safety that permeated multiple levels of military command. The friendly fire incident that had injured Thompson and Davis wasn't an isolated accident. It was the predictable result of institutional decisions that valued efficiency over effectiveness. The same patterns she had documented at Fort Reynolds were present at Fort Campbell, suggesting that similar problems likely existed throughout the military system. That night, Sarah compiled her findings into a comprehensive report that would form the basis of her recommendations to the Pentagon Task Force. As she worked late into the evening, she reflected on how her simple act of refusing to wear a uniform had evolved into an investigation that could potentially save countless soldiers' lives. Her phone buzzed with a message from General Williams. "Lieutenant, preliminary reports from other installations confirm your findings. Congressional hearings have been scheduled. Your testimony will be crucial." Sarah stared at the message, realizing that her investigation was about to enter an entirely new phase. Soon she would be presenting her findings not just to military leadership, but to the elected officials responsible for overseeing military spending and policy. The stakes had grown far beyond anything she had imagined when she stood in her quarters at Fort Reynolds, staring at a uniform she couldn't bring herself to wear. The Hart Senate Office Building's committee room was unlike any environment Sarah had ever experienced. Ornate wood paneling, marble columns, and rows of television cameras created an atmosphere of formal gravity that seemed designed to intimidate witnesses. As she took her seat at the witness table, Sarah could see dozens of reporters, military officials, and civilian observers filling the gallery behind her. Senator Margaret Thompson, the chairwoman of the Senate Armed Services Committee, called the hearing to order with a sharp rap of her gavel. "This committee convenes today to examine serious allegations regarding military equipment procurement and soldier safety. Our first witness is Lieutenant Sarah Martinez, whose investigation has brought these concerns to our attention." Sarah adjusted the microphone in front of her, acutely aware that her testimony would be broadcast live and could influence military policy for years to come. She had spent the previous week preparing with General Williams and Pentagon legal advisors, but nothing could have fully prepared her for the weight of this moment. "Lieutenant Martinez," Senator Thompson continued, "please raise your right hand. Do you swear that the testimony you are about to give is the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth?" "I do, ma'am." "Please proceed with your opening statement." Sarah looked directly at the panel of senators, her voice steady despite the magnitude of the occasion. Senators, 3 weeks ago, I made a decision that I knew would likely end my military career. I refused to wear my uniform because I could no longer represent an institution that was failing in its fundamental duty to protect American soldiers. Murmur rippled through the gallery, and several committee members leaned forward with obvious interest. Sarah continued, her confidence growing as she spoke. What I discovered during my investigation wasn't just isolated equipment failures or bureaucratic oversights. I uncovered a systematic pattern of decision-making that prioritizes cost savings over soldier safety, contract schedules over operational readiness, and institutional convenience over moral responsibility. Senator James Morrison, a Republican from Texas with a strong military background, interrupted. Lieutenant, those are serious accusations. Can you provide specific evidence to support these claims? Sarah opened her prepared briefing folder, revealing photographs, technical reports, and financial analyses she had compiled. Senator Morrison, I have documented evidence of equipment failures at 17 military installations across the United States. These failures have resulted in training accidents, friendly fire incidents, and compromised operational capabilities. She held up a photograph of the damaged communication equipment from Fort Campbell. This radio failed during a training exercise, causing a friendly fire incident that left 2 soldiers wounded. Similar equipment has failed at installations in North Carolina, Georgia, California, and Colorado. Senator Thompson studied the photograph with obvious concern. Lieutenant, what is the common factor in these equipment failures? Ma'am, all of the problematic equipment was manufactured by the same contractor, Meridian Defense Solutions, under contracts that prioritized low cost over performance standards. When military personnel reported equipment problems, their concerns were consistently dismissed as operational issues rather than safety hazards. Senator Lisa Chun, a Democrat from California, examined some of the technical documentation Sarah had provided. Lieutenant Martinez, your report indicates that addressing these equipment problems would actually save money in the long term. Can you explain this conclusion? Sarah had prepared extensively for this question, knowing it would be crucial to gaining congressional support for reform measures. Senator Chun, over the past 5 years, equipment failures have cost the military approximately $400 million in additional expenses. This includes medical care for injured soldiers, replacement of damaged equipment, extended training periods, and operational delays. The number drew audible gasps from several committee members. Senator Morrison looked skeptical. Lieutenant, $400 million is a substantial figure. How did you calculate this amount? Sir, I analyzed military medical records, equipment replacement costs, and training schedule extensions at installations where equipment failures occurred. I also factored in the cost of deploying soldiers with unreliable equipment to combat zones, which requires additional support resources and backup systems. Sarah pulled out a detailed financial analysis that she had spent days perfecting. For example, when communication equipment fails in combat zones, military units must deploy additional personnel and backup systems to maintain operational effectiveness. These deployments cost an average of $2 million per incident. Senator Chun nodded approvingly. So you're saying that investing in higher quality equipment would not only improve soldier safety, but also reduce overall military expenses? Exactly, ma'am. We've been focusing on the upfront cost of equipment contracts, while ignoring the long-term costs of equipment failures. Quality equipment costs more initially, but saves money over its operational lifetime. Senator Morrison wasn't entirely convinced. Lieutenant, don't you think military personnel should be trained to handle equipment failures? Combat conditions aren't perfect, and soldiers need to be prepared for situations where equipment doesn't work as intended. Sarah had anticipated this objection and was ready with a response. Senator Morrison, there's an important distinction between training soldiers to handle unexpected equipment failures and deliberately deploying equipment that's likely to fail. Training for contingencies is essential, but creating unnecessary risks is negligent. The exchange continued for several minutes, with Senator Morrison pressing Sarah on the balance between cost considerations and performance standards. Eventually, Senator Thompson intervened to move the hearing forward. "Lieutenant Martinez, what specific recommendations do you have for addressing these problems?" Sarah consulted her notes, presenting the comprehensive reform package she had developed with the Pentagon Task Force. "Senator Thompson, I recommend implementing 3 key changes to military equipment procurement." She outlined her first recommendation: establish mandatory performance standards that prioritize soldier safety over cost considerations. Equipment contracts should be awarded based on reliability and effectiveness, not just price. Second, create independent oversight mechanisms for equipment testing and evaluation. Military personnel who report equipment problems should have direct access to safety inspectors who are not influenced by contract relationships or budget pressures. Third, implement financial accountability measures for contractors whose equipment fails to meet safety standards. Companies should bear the cost of equipment failures, including medical expenses for injured soldiers and operational delays caused by their products. Senator Chun took extensive notes as Sarah spoke. "Lieutenant, how would these changes affect military readiness and budget constraints?" "Ma'am, these changes would improve military readiness by ensuring that soldiers train with equipment they can rely on in combat. While they might increase upfront procurement costs, they would significantly reduce long-term expenses and improve operational effectiveness." The hearing continued for another 2 hours, with senators questioning Sarah about technical details, implementation challenges, and potential resistance from military contractors. Throughout the session, Sarah maintained her composure and provided detailed, factual responses that demonstrated her thorough understanding of the issues. As the hearing concluded, Senator Thompson addressed Sarah directly. "Lieutenant Martinez, your testimony today has been enlightening and concerning. This committee will carefully consider your recommendations as we develop legislation to address these problems." But the most significant moment came from an unexpected source. Senator Morrison, who had been Sarah's most skeptical questioner, made a concluding statement that surprised everyone in the room. "Lieutenant Martinez, I want to acknowledge that your courage in bringing these issues to light represents the best traditions of military service. You chose to put soldier safety above personal career considerations, and that decision may save countless lives." He paused, looking directly at Sarah. "I also want to note that your refusal to wear the uniform was not an act of disrespect to the military. It was an act of respect for what the military should represent. You reminded us that wearing the uniform means something more than following orders. It means taking responsibility for the welfare of the men and women who serve alongside you." The gallery erupted in applause, and Sarah felt tears welling in her eyes. After weeks of investigation, documentation, and testimony, she finally felt that her message was being understood by the people who had the power to create meaningful change. As the hearing adjourned, reporters crowded around Sarah, eager for additional comments. But her attention was focused on a familiar face in the gallery, Colonel Harrison from Fort Reynolds, who had traveled to Washington to support her testimony. "Colonel, I didn't expect to see you here." Colonel Harrison smiled warmly. "Lieutenant, I wouldn't have missed this for anything. What you started at Fort Reynolds is going to change how the entire military thinks about equipment procurement and soldier safety." As they left the Hart Building together, Sarah realized that her journey was far from over. Congressional hearings were just the beginning of a reform process that would require sustained effort and continued courage from military personnel at all levels. But for the first time since she had stood in her quarters at Fort Reynolds, staring at a uniform she couldn't wear, Sarah felt confident that her sacrifice was creating the change she had hoped to achieve. 6 months after her congressional testimony, Sarah stood in the Pentagon Ceremonial Hall, wearing her dress uniform, with 3 new ribbons adorning her chest: the Army Commendation Medal, the Meritorious Service Medal, and a Special Recognition Ribbon for Exceptional Service to Military Safety, awards she never could have imagined receiving when she first refused to wear her uniform at Fort Reynolds. The ceremony was unlike anything she had experienced. Secretary of Defense Robert Carlyle, a distinguished veteran with graying temples and a reputation for decisive leadership, stepped to the podium to address the assembled crowd of military officials, congressional representatives, and journalists. Today, we gather not just to recognize exceptional service, but to celebrate a transformation in how our military approaches equipment procurement and soldier safety. Secretary Carlyle began, his voice carrying across the packed auditorium. Lieutenant Martinez's courage in challenging systemic problems has resulted in reforms that will protect American soldiers for generations to come. Sarah maintained her military bearing, but internally she reflected on the extraordinary journey that had brought her to this moment. The Military Equipment Safety Act, passed by Congress just 2 weeks earlier, incorporated every recommendation she had made during her testimony. More importantly, it established permanent oversight mechanisms that would prevent the problems she had identified from recurring. The reforms we implement today, Secretary Carlyle continued, represent the largest overhaul of military procurement procedures in 30 years. Every equipment contract will now be evaluated using safety criteria that prioritize soldier welfare over cost considerations. He turned to face Sarah directly. Lieutenant Martinez, your investigation identified equipment failures at 43 military installations. Because of your efforts, we have terminated contracts with 17 different contractors whose products failed to meet safety standards. We have also implemented new testing protocols that will prevent similar problems from affecting future generations of soldiers. The applause was thunderous, but Sarah's attention was drawn to familiar faces in the audience. Private Thompson and Specialist Davis, the soldiers injured at Fort Campbell, were seated in the front row, their presence a powerful reminder of why her investigation had been necessary. Both had recovered completely from their injuries and had specifically requested permission to attend the ceremony. General Williams approached the podium as Secretary Carlyle concluded his remarks. Ladies and gentlemen, it's my honor to present Lieutenant Sarah Martinez with the Department of Defense Award for Excellence in Military Safety, the highest recognition our department can bestow for contributions to soldier welfare. As Sarah stepped forward to receive the award, General Williams spoke quietly so only she could hear. Lieutenant, this award represents more than recognition for your investigation. It represents our commitment to ensuring that moral courage is rewarded, not punished, in the American military. The ceremony continued with presentations from various officials, but the most meaningful moment came when Colonel Harrison took the stage. Sarah hadn't expected him to speak, and his presence added personal significance to the formal recognition. 6 months ago, Lieutenant Martinez walked into my formation wearing civilian clothes, Colonel Harrison said, his voice carrying the authority that had intimidated so many officers throughout his career. At that moment, I had a choice. I could have focused on her violation of military protocol, or I could have listened to her concerns about soldier safety. He paused, scanning the audience before continuing. Her refusal to wear the uniform wasn't an act of disrespect. It was a statement that the uniform means something. It represents our commitment to protect the men and women who serve our country. When that commitment is compromised, the uniform loses its meaning. Sarah felt tears forming in her eyes as the colonel continued. Today, because of Lieutenant Martinez's courage, soldiers across the United States military are training with equipment they can trust. They're using communication systems that won't fail them in combat. They're protected by safety protocols that prioritize their welfare over bureaucratic convenience. After the ceremony, Sarah found herself surrounded by reporters eager for her reaction to the recognition and the broader reforms. But her focus was on the personal conversations that mattered most to her. Sergeant Rodriguez, who had traveled from Fort Reynolds for the ceremony, embraced Sarah warmly. "Lieutenant, you can't imagine how much has changed at our base. The new safety protocols you helped establish have already prevented 2 potential accidents. The soldiers there consider you a hero." Private Thompson approached with a broad smile, his left shoulder moving normally despite the shrapnel wounds he had sustained. "Ma'am, I wanted to thank you personally. When I was lying in that hospital bed, I never imagined that my injury would lead to changes that could save other soldiers' lives." Specialist Davis nodded in agreement. "Lieutenant, the new communication equipment they've deployed at Fort Campbell is incredible. We've run dozens of training exercises without a single equipment failure. It's like night and day compared to what we were dealing with before." The personal testimonies meant more to Sarah than any formal recognition could provide. These were the soldiers whose safety had motivated her investigation, and their well-being remained her primary concern. As the event concluded, Sarah walked through the Pentagon corridors that had become familiar over the past 6 months. Her assignment to the task force had evolved into a permanent position overseeing military safety standards, giving her ongoing authority to investigate equipment problems and implement corrective measures. Her phone buzzed with a message from an unknown number. "Lieutenant Martinez, this is Captain Jessica Walsh from Fort Bragg. We've identified equipment problems similar to what you documented at Fort Reynolds. Could you assist with an investigation?" Sarah smiled at the message, recognizing that her work was far from over. The reforms she had helped implement were significant, but maintaining military safety standards would require ongoing vigilance and continued willingness to challenge problems as they emerged. That evening, Sarah returned to her quarters and opened her closet where her various uniforms hung in precise order. The same dress uniform that had symbolized her internal conflict 6 months earlier now represented something entirely different. It represented an institution that had listened to her concerns, implemented meaningful changes, and demonstrated that moral courage could be rewarded rather than punished. As she prepared for bed, Sarah reflected on the unexpected path her career had taken. She had joined the military to serve her country and protect her fellow soldiers. When she refused to wear her uniform that morning at Fort Reynolds, she had feared that her military career was over. Instead, her act of conscience had opened doors to influence military policy at the highest levels. Her investigation had resulted in safer equipment for soldiers across the United States military. Her testimony had convinced Congress to pass comprehensive reforms that would prevent similar problems for years to come. More importantly, her example had encouraged other military personnel to speak up about safety concerns. Over the past 6 months, Sarah had received dozens of messages from soldiers at various installations who had been inspired to report equipment problems or procedural violations that might have otherwise been ignored. The culture of accountability she had helped establish was perhaps more significant than any specific reform measure. Military personnel now understood that questioning unsafe practices was not only acceptable but expected. The institutional changes went beyond equipment procurement to encompass a broader commitment to soldier welfare. Sarah's journey from a conflicted lieutenant at Fort Reynolds to a recognized leader in military safety reform had demonstrated that individual courage could create systemic change. Her refusal to wear a uniform had evolved into a mission to ensure that every soldier who wore that uniform could do so with pride and confidence. As she drifted off to sleep, Sarah thought about the thousands of soldiers who would benefit from the safety protocols she had helped establish. Equipment failures that might have caused injuries or deaths would be prevented. Communication systems that soldiers could rely on would enhance their effectiveness and survival in combat situations. The uniform hanging in her closet represented not just her own service, but the collective commitment of the United States military to protect and honor the men and women who defended their country. By refusing to wear it when that commitment was compromised, Sarah had helped restore its true meaning. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new investigations, and new opportunities to improve military safety standards. But tonight, Sarah Martinez slept peacefully, knowing that her courage had made a difference that would endure long after her own military service had ended. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.